Today is International Widows Day, a time to reflect not only on the plight of women who've lost their spouses, but also on the myriad challenges they often face on top of that heartbreak. In often overlooked parts of the world, when a woman loses a partner, they can also lose their basic human rights. Their inheritance can be denied, their property can be seized, they might even be kicked out of their homes, and their dignity washed away. In the most extreme cases, they can even be treated like property themselves.
Akaniambia sasa sitaki urudi Nairobi, nataka huyu ataishi kwa hii nyumba, hata bado kwa mdogo tunaweza saa. Mimi nililia, nikaona ni kama amenidharau.
That's just one example, by the way. And to address some of these problems, activists are trying to provide widows with desperately needed resources and support. One organization called the Global Fund for Widows is empowering them with training and financing so they can build sustainable enterprises to press ahead. Time now for the exchange, where we're speaking with the founder of that organization. Ibrahim-Leathers joins us from the Global Fund for Widows. She's live for us now in New York. Heather, thank you so much for being with us. What does the world need to know? What does the world need to know about what widows everywhere are experiencing, especially in certain parts of the world, when it comes to the loss of basic human rights?
Thank you so much, Zain, for having me. And yes, indeed, the tragedies that widows endure are quite severe, especially on the continent and in the global south. Widows really endure three main forms of human rights violations. The first is this disinheritance, and it's almost 80% of widows that we speak with. They're unable to inherit their home, their land, even assets they brought into the marriage themselves, and oftentimes they can't even inherit their own children. The second is discrimination. These are laws and policies that prevent the widow from actually accessing justice or social protections or capital in order to start businesses. And the third is what we call harmful traditional practices, and about 50% of widows report that they're victims to what is culturally mandated violence against women, oftentimes sexual violence. And all of these violations have the effect of plunging the widow and her family into poverty, leaving her food insecure, leaving her unable to educate her children, and from that, of course, forcing her to make very serious and tragic decisions, like, surrendering her daughter to child marriage or to human traffickers, and for her sons to be made vulnerable to extremist recruitment.
Yeah, we just actually played an example of one widow being sort of coaxed or encouraged to marry her deceased husband's brother, as one example, and that, as you and I both know, happens a lot. But why isn't this issue more widely talked about? Why isn't it more widely discussed? I just sort of feel as though this is under the radar for a lot of people. It's certainly overlooked.
Certainly. Well, these widows have been abused, essentially, and again, we're talking about a massive percentage of the population. This is about 36% of the population, the female population in sub-Saharan Africa, and certainly in contexts of war, it's much more than that. It's about 80% of the population. So when we're looking at what these widows endure, they're humiliated, they're violated, and they move into silence mode. And that's typical of victims. The other thing that happens is that they're mothers of young children. Most widows are actually not old ladies, but they were widowed under the age of 39, and almost 100% of them are responsible for young children. So they move into survival mode. So between those two, they really aren't speaking about their tragedy. They go into silence mode, and so if they're not talking, it's almost impossible for us for these violations to enter into the global consciousness, and that's what Global Fund for Widows has been doing for the last 15 years, is trying to bring that narrative to the fore.
I mean, it's interesting because one of the things that I guess, I was educated on in terms of me researching this topic, is just the fact that in a lot of societies, obviously, one factor that complicates things for these widows is the fact that the definition of a spouse is somewhat fluid. That is why a lot of these women's rights is not recognized. A spouse is so much more than a husband with a certificate where you have a marriage certificate. A spouse can mean a lot more than that. Can you just walk us through that aspect of it?
Sure, absolutely. So in the global north, when we get married, there's a certificate. The marriage is codified and that registration lives with the government. So the woman can actually prove her marriage. But that's not necessarily true with customary marriages, and that's how most marriages, over 80%, are consummated in the global south. And so what happens is that we have different forms of widowhood that we really have to understand. The first is the de facto widow, whose husband is in fact deceased. But again, how do you define husband? If there's a marriage certificate, it's easy. If there isn't, it becomes a much bigger problem for the widow. The second form of widow that we define at Global Fund for Widows is what we call the functional widow. This is the widow whose husband may have disappeared, voluntarily or involuntarily. If it's either one, or usually involuntarily, is it a state or non-state actor that perpetrated it? And would either of those offer a death certificate to the widow? Unlikely. And so she lives in a state of despair.
And so Heather, before we wrap up, just walk us through what Global Fund for Widows is actually doing to assist a lot of these women who are going through this.
Well, thank you. At Global Fund for Widows, I'm a banker by training. I've been on Wall Street for 16 years, and my programming is informed by the golden rule. She who has the gold makes the rules. And so we've invented a small modification to what is ubiquitous informal banks in Africa. They're called ususus or vokobas or sakos. But essentially, we have widows grouped together in groups of 25. We train them. We encourage them to save a small amount of money. And then when they are ready to launch their small microbank, or their wasala, as we call it, the Widows Savings and Loan Association, they invest about 33% of what it costs to start their own business. And then we support with another 67%, a 2-for-1 match. So the widow's immediately wealthier by 200% from day one, and then she's able to borrow money from her wasala, start her business, and then pay herself back with interest at a later date when she's ready. And so we're able to increase their savings and their income.
So it's all about economic empowerment is really the first step here.
Exactly.
Heather Ibrahim-Leathers, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much.